I mentioned earlier that personal pronouns are not the only kind of pronoun, and there are a few others that we do need to know and we should be familiar with for the SAT, and those are relative, indefinite, and reflexive pronouns. And for some reason, I forgot to add, don't know why, demonstrative pronouns as well. Demonstrative. So let's talk about these types of pronouns. So demonstrative pronouns, again, you likely know these. Well, that's what a lot of grammar is. You know this stuff. It's just about putting the language on it to talk about it in specific ways. So demonstrative pronouns are these pronouns. This, that, these, those, and such. So you can imagine we use these when we're pointing to things or indicating things in space around us, right? So for instance, I could say, I want that, as I point to some car over, on a lot. Or I could say specifically, I want that car, right? So that could be used, or this could be used, or those can be used just by themselves to indicate something. So here it's not so much like a referential pronoun because it's nothing in the sentence that's referring to. It's more something in the environment. Or I could use it almost as an adjective. I want that car, right? That particular car, not any one of those other cars. So this is not tested specifically, so you won't have to know the difference between should it be this or that or those or these, anything like that. But you do have to watch for something I call dummy pronouns. And I talk a lot more about this and give a lot more examples in the Grammar Tactics series, so let me show you one here. Robin witnessed the 1980 Miracle on Ice, and this was responsible for his love of hockey. So be very, very careful. We see this demonstrative pronoun, but just like with the other referential pronouns, what does this refer to in the sentence, right? This, in this case, is actually something referential. It's referring to something specific in the sentence. What? Is it the 1980 Miracle on Ice? Maybe, could be. Or is it more likely his witnessing of the 1980 Miracle on Ice made him responsible for his love of hockey? It's not clear what exactly this is referring to. So whenever you see this, they, anything like that in a sentence, be very careful. Make sure, again, it's referring to something specific, that it's not just hanging out there, that we're not just inferring this from context. So again, dummy pronouns, be very careful with them. There's a lot more examples in Grammar Tactics. Relative pronouns, another really important class. These are used in relative clauses, which we'll talk about in a second, to refer back to a noun in the main clause. So your relative pronouns are who, which, that, when, and where. Now, who you generally use to refer to people. Which and that you refer to things or sometimes animals, depending on the context. When can only be used to refer to times. And where can only be used to refer to places. So, those are your pronouns. Now, what about relative clauses? Now, we haven't really talked about clauses yet. We will in a bit. The point of a clause or a relative clause is to give some more information about a pronoun, about a noun, that goes beyond simple like regular adjectives or prepositional phrases. So, for example, my brother, who was in the army, came home yesterday. So here is our relative clause. Here's our relative pronoun. It refers back always to the noun right before it. So my brother, who is in the army, so the who is referring back to the brother, and it's a brother in the army, right? So specifying the particular brother that came home yesterday. So this is a relative clause, and this is another important distinction to make between an essential and a non-essential, also known as a restrictive or non-restrictive clause. When there's no commas around it, as there is no commas here, this is necessary. You can't delete this from the sentence because doing so gets rid of something critical to the sentence's meaning, to what's going on, to which brother in particular you're pointing at. Whereas a non-essential clause or non-restrictive clause is one that it's not as important, it's not as central, so we can just put commas around it in that case. And it could, in theory, be eliminated from the sentence without really harming the meaning of it. So here's the same sentence just with commas. My brother, who was in the army, came home yesterday. So notice with the commas and with the way even I read it, this part of the sentence, while, gives us information, is not as important as it was in the first. Right? In the first one, I'm indicating to you a specific brother. So let's say I had 6 brothers, and I want to let you know which one came home. I would say the brother who's in the army, right? That brother came home yesterday. So this is essential information for the sentence. If we delete it, we don't know who the brother is. For this one, this is more kind of incidental side information that, while important, is not critical. So my brother, who, by the way, is in the army, came home yesterday, right? So here I'm pretty much indicating that I just have one brother, so I don't really need to distinguish between them. And it's almost, oh, by the way, he's in the army. That's kind of part of the story here, but not really essential, right? So notice the difference between the two. And this just leads to the general rule that anything in commas, you can pretty much just ignore for the purposes of looking at the structure of a sentence. They usually throw those things in there on the SAT to confuse you. Let's look at another example. The story that I read today was exciting. So again, here we're using that to refer back to the story. When we use that, it's generally going to be an essential clause or essential phrase. So here, it's a specific story. It's the story that I read today was exciting. Whereas in this sentence, the story, which I read today, was exciting. The fact that I read it today is not as important as it was in the original, which is why we put commas around it and we use which instead of that. Now, whether you use that or which, that's a whole grammar thing, not something tested on the SAT. The main point with these is being able to recognize a relative clause and know its boundaries. Know that, okay, here's my relative clause. It starts here and ends here because here's my subject, here's my verb, and here's the rest of the sentence, right? Same thing here. Here's my subject, here's my verb, which goes with this subject, and here's the rest of the sentence. So this stuff in the middle and the commas, again, you could ignore. And even if it's not in commas, you got to be able to tell a difference about what parts goes with what. So that's a relative clause, and we'll have a lot more to say about that later and also in the tactic series. Indefinite pronouns. So these are pronouns that don't refer to, again, anything specific in the sentence. So they're not referential. But they are important because the main thing with these is that they're generally going to be singular. So everybody, anybody, somebody, each, every, and of course one are going to be singular. So when you see each, or you see every, or you see everybody, they're singular. So they're going to take singular verbs. And if you were replacing, and if there was a pronoun that was replacing them, like its or his or anything like that, it would also be singular. So keep that in mind. They are singular. We're going to see this in subject-verb agreement and pronoun agreement. The last pronoun doesn't come up very often at all, but we should know it, is the reflexive pronoun. And we use this when the subject of the sentence does some action to him or her or itself. So notice what I used here. Himself, herself, itself. And here are the reflexive pronouns. First person, myself. Second person, yourself. So first, second person. Third person would be himself or herself, or even itself, technically. And then this is first person plural. And this is third person plural. Right? So when do we use these? Again, we use these when the subject of the sentence does something to itself. So here, I washed myself. I did something to myself. So we use myself. I don't say, I washed me. You don't do that in English. Same thing with this sentence. He hit himself. Not he hit him, because then it wouldn't make it clear. Notice there we have a problem because we have no idea who he hit, right? He hit him. Well, it could be himself. It could be a lot of people. So we use himself to indicate that it's the subject. Or we did this to ourselves. Again, we did something to ourselves. Now, what's an error? One error you might see on the SAT looks like this. Direct any inquiries to Bob or myself. This is another example, kind of almost a case error, where it's a case of overcorrection. We use myself sometimes in this manner because it sounds fancy or sounds proper. But actually, this is wrong. Technically, we would use me. Again, it's the object pronoun. We use me. It's the object case. We would not use myself. So when you see a reflexive pronoun used in a manner other than this, it's likely wrong. However, what about this sentence? To avoid any further complications, Janet will talk to the clients herself. So notice here, this is not meant to refer to anything. It's not receiving the action of the sentence. This is actually an okay use of the reflexive pronoun. It's a very minor and rare one. This is the form of the reflexive called the intensive pronoun. Basically, it serves to emphasize something in a sentence, right? To avoid any further complications, Janet will talk to the clients herself, right? It emphasizes that, okay, Janet is going to take control, and she herself is going to do this, no one else, right? So it's about that emphasis. It's more of a stylistic thing than anything else. So this would be a correct usage of the reflexive, so you would not want to indicate that this was wrong. So the place where it's going to be wrong is when another pronoun like me would be more appropriate. Notice I could eliminate the herself and nothing is wrong, right? Janet will talk to the clients. Fine. Janet will talk to the clients herself. Fine. Different emphasis, but both okay. One final note, you won't have to make any distinguishing, you won't have to distinguish at all between who and whom or whose or anything like that. While other tests might have you do that, the SAT does not. So if you ever see who or whom underlined, that's never going to be the problem in itself, unless the who or the whom or the whose is referring to a non-person. So if I said the theory who believes, of course that is silly. That error could come up, but you never have to choose between who and whom. So don't worry about that for the test. Okay, next video.